I don't mind it that he's always right, but that he has to be smug about it. However, knowing yourself is no small thing. And it isn't easy. Now, there are several levels of self-knowledge because we exist on several levels of being. The highest type of self-knowledge is to know yourself from the vantage of the life spirit. And the life spirit is the universal selfness out of which all the selves are formed. It's sort of like the ocean, and all of us are little eddies in the ocean. And if you see yourself from the vantage of life spirit, that you can see yourself completely, and you can see yourself without any individual bias. And this is referred to in the Rosicrucian Temple service when it says, "We shall know even as we are known." Now, at a less exalted state that is still transcendent, self-knowledge is what some people would call baptism in the Holy Spirit. That is when you are in yourself as a spiritual being, as a divine being, as a divinity. We're lucky if we have that for a moment in our lives. But the elder brothers, the adepts of the Rosicrucian order, are in that state of consciousness all the time. They can speak any language as if they were natives of that language. And anything like that is accessible to them. You know, all these people are trying to save languages that are disappearing. They don't need to. Because if you get there, it's all available to you. The nostalgia of things like that I find very unpleasant. We consider ourselves very lucky to have that experience at all. Because we know then without a doubt, at the very core of our being, we are spiritual. Now, self-knowledge is lacking in most of us at other levels of our existence. For example, we have habits which other people find obnoxious and of which we're completely oblivious. We don't even know that we're bothering other people. Sometimes we have very serious health conditions and don't even know it. A lot of women are pregnant and they go through most of the pregnancy without knowing they're pregnant. Now, because of this unawareness, we employ various means to become self-aware. For example, in the physical plane, some people use litmus strips to check whether the insulin glucose level, the balance is in a right place. That's kind of physical self-knowledge. Sometimes I myself have a tendency to get carried away with things and to overextend myself, and when that happens, I lose track of myself. And so along the way, I've learned several things so that I can be aware of what's going on. One example is, if I start leaving the LYs off of adverbs, that means I'm tired, and I'm cutting corners, and I'm cutting LYs. I also find that if I get low on blood sugar, I can't remember things that I normally remember. It's altogether different than having a senior moment, but there are some things that you know you can remember and you can't do it. Of course, some of that is a psychological block. Now, one of the things that I find that indicates whether I am in tune spiritually or not is whether I can produce apt analogies to illustrate difficult things. And that, if I can't produce the analogies, that means I'm out of touch spiritually. Now that is classical. The ability to analogize is an indicator in all people of spiritual awakeness. Now, in these talks we have been dividing representations of cycles both horizontally and vertically. And to some this would seem like a convenient convention, sort of like making a grid work to graph something or another. But these representations actually stand for spiritual principles that are universal. For example, the horizontal principle that is effective on any one plane is called the principle of action. In physics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Of course, the way it happens spiritually, it's much more complex, and it carries much more information than just the amount of energy that is reacting. When it comes back, it carries everything that went out in the action. Max Heindel called the principle of action the principle of cause and consequence. And he used the word consequence instead of effect, because that brings out the moral quality of what you do. The principle, moral principles that you're using or abusing, when they come back, that's a very important thing. Now the vertical, the symbol for the vertical is classical. That classically represents the principle of analogy. Max Heindel referred to it by one of its historical names. It is called the Hermetic Axiom. And the Hermetic Axiom, if you hear it in full, it is, there's Paul. The Hermetic Axiom was named after Hermes Trismegistus, who was a very great spiritual teacher in ancient Egypt. Hermes Trismegistus means thrice born Hermes. And the Hermetic Axiom goes, as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. Now, the principle of analogy is equally as important, if not more important, than the principle of action. Through the principle of analogy, in creative manifestation, the universal spirit, which is universal, which means it's one spirit, it is maintained throughout the entire creation on every level of manifestation that the universal spirit makes. Which means that the grand, the universal itself, is everything. But then there are other levels of manifestation all the way down to atoms and things like that on the physical plane. But all of those things have one analogy, or have an analogy to the one, would probably be a better way to say it. And that analogy is a way that the unity of the Spirit is maintained in vertical differentiation. So the principle of analogy, or the idea of analogy, is extremely important. Recognition through the principle of analogy is functional. It is how new creative things are brought into the horizontal. You can initiate new causes, but you initiate them, so to speak, from above. And if you're extracting the soul out of experiences, that is also done according to the principle of analogy. So the absorption and assimilation of soul material is accomplished through analogy. That's using it as an active principle. Now, the principle of action and the principle of analogy work together in creation. And so it's not really a surprise that if you put them together, you have the addition sign, the plus sign. In fact, that you're doing something more. You're adding something to the waking objective consciousness in the universal spirit. Progress through these two principles is, when they set things spinning, so to speak, is how the cosmic creation is accomplished. Now, in the talk previous to this, we saw that the horizontal and vertical in the natural are the natural axis in the annular cycle. The line of the solstices and the line of the equinoxes, they divide the annular cycle. Now, we could just as well have used them as the natural axis of sunrise and sunset on the horizontal and noon and midnight in the vertical. And the work that is done in the diurnal, the daily cycle, is analogous to the work that is done in the annular cycle. And that analogy goes up through all of the spiritual worlds until there is unity. Some sacred texts comment on this. There was a time about 25 years ago that every year I would read the Bhagavad Gita because it's such a beautiful book. And in the Bhagavad Gita, they do that very thing. They talk about the solstices and equinoxes. So, if we put these prosaic examples together and redound them on themselves through the principle of analogy, this brings out a very important creative process. An important way of looking back. All of these talks are about looking back. There is no term for the process, but we experience it as cycles within cycles. You go through many days in that diurnal cycle, and you have a year. And you can follow that up higher, and you can follow it deeper into a smaller kind of manifestation. Now, in the Rosicrucian CosmoConception, Part 2 of the Rosicrucian CosmoConception describes the evolutionary creation. The creation in which we are very fortunate to participate. Formally, a description or explanation of that kind of a process is called cosmogony. It is how the universe is born. How the universe is run is cosmology, and how it is born is called cosmogony. Even though it takes up a big hunk of the book, it is still very abbreviated and it's simplified. And it's presented only from the point of view of the human life wave. It mentions the other life waves like the plants and the animals and things like that, and higher hierarchies, but it doesn't look at things from their point of view. Now, despite the fact that it is abbreviated and simplified, it is still amazingly complicated. It's difficult to follow, even in simplified rendition. Max Heindel suggests that we study that. And if for no other reason, it is something that takes us away from the baser, mundane things that we have in our life, like television or crossword puzzles or things like that, especially if we're involved in all kinds of personal intrigue or things like that. We lose sight of spiritual things, but if we focus into the cosmic creation and the evolutionary process that works through it, it takes us away from our petty personal lives. Now, his suggestion is very important because it touches on what I have found to be a stumbling block for us as Rosicrucian students and aspirants. It is something by which we inhibit our progress and we inhibit our soul growth. And you know what that means? That means, uh-oh, here comes the sermon. I find the situation that we are in to be highly ironic. And there are several ironies in it. It is ironic that it is one of the very best qualities of Max Heindel, for which he was chosen to be the messenger of the Rosicrucian order. And that is the stumbling block. Max Heindel communicated with extraordinary clarity. And he was conscious of what the spiritual truth that he was sharing. So he could be clear. And then you wonder, well, what can be wrong with that? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. The elder brothers made an excellent choice in having him as a messenger because he was so clear. The problem in it is that it is remarkably clear information. Not to say that there should be obscure or unclear information, but there is a problem when something is that clear. It is more a matter of what we haven't done with that clear information. It's sort of like the statement in Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, where he says, "The fault is not in the stars, but in us." And as I see it, which could be wrong, we are so intransigent in accepting that clarity and truth of Max Heindel's writings that it becomes a stumbling block for us. We read the Rosicrucian CosmoConception, and I think all of us can remember the first time we read it, and we were cheering, saying, "Oh, I know what that's all about now." They were so clear, and we intuitively knew they were true. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what it's supposed to do. The problem is that too much of the enthusiasm stops there. It's not so much a matter that we don't try to live better lives and that we don't serve, because we all do in our own way. The problem is that we don't continue to penetrate the surface of that very clear material that was given to us. And that's not the fault of Max Heindel, because if you look through his writings, he tells us again and again and again that there is much more. And that if we ponder it, if we study it, if we penetrate it, that we will find all sorts of spiritual nuggets that will inspire us, if not make our lives better practically. So we can't fault him on that. But it maybe would have been better if he had been like St. Paul and said, I wanted to talk to you about spiritual things, but because of the quality of your life, I have to scold you. That's the way he says it in some of the letters. Now, most of us in this room are of such an age that we have the blessing of time. We can do service as we do service, but we can also immerse ourselves in the spiritual philosophy, and we can penetrate it more deeply. And when we do that, our time is coming soon, sooner than we might guess, that we're not going to be here and we're going to be living in the spiritual worlds. And if we have penetrated those writings and what they point to, we can benefit much more from the period in between lives. So we've got the time. So I think it's best that that we do it. By doing that, we might be able to take several giant steps in our progress. That's the end of the service, which is also a self-castigation because I don't do it enough. Now there is irony in the Rosicrucian cosmogony also. And that is, for all of its complexity, it is based on very simple principles. Very simple principles. There are 7 material forms in space, and they go through different materialities to be formed. And there are 7 qualities in periods of time, and there are 7 circulations through the materials in form and the qualities and time. And they're called revolutions of consciousness. That's all there is to it. All of the globes, all of the periods, and all of the revolutions are analogous. So you will see the whole of the creation. If you can get the basic idea and work with it, you can get to anything in the creation. Now, all of the qualities and even the globes can be given planetary names, and the same names apply because the analogy is true all the way through the whole business. And that's pretty simple. However, being simple doesn't mean that it isn't deep, because the manifestation of it is very deep. Spiritual things are of imponderable depth. We can take them as deep as we want to. There is no limit to this depth of spiritual things. The only limit is in us and our trying and our abilities. Now we remember in this that our individual being at the start of this whole creation was potential. We were not individual beings. We were only potential beings. And we existed in the universal spirit in a way that was virgin to objectivity, and it was virgin to individuality, and it was virgin to waking self-consciousness. We were in a kind of spiritual bliss. A spiritual bliss without differentiation. And the intent in the creation and our entering into it was to bring out more individuality, because there's a potential infinite number of different kinds of individuality. And there is much more objectivity that can be accomplished. And there can be more creativity in the universal spirit if we are wakingly conscious. So, that is the purpose of the creation. the evolution of consciousness. Max Heindel states that very clearly. And that is what we are to do. Now the activity or the actualization was done within the universal spirit. And the universal spirit that was in charge, which some people would call God, there is a waking intelligence within the universal spirit, and that is the creative center. That is the creative genius of the entire creation. You can take this to any level that you want. You can go deeper into the spirit than the CosmoConception does. You can take it to galactic levels and beyond. This was a great sharing that was cosmic in its range and in its scope. But it's something that's not different from our experience. Sometimes we experience something that's extremely beautiful, or something that is very emotionally moving, or we discover a truth, and we have that urge to share it, and we have that urge for it to grow. That's healthy. That's in all of us. And that is the same for the universal spirit. And though we call it a creation or an evolutionary creation, some people just call it an evolution all alone, but that leaves out the creative quality of it, we don't realize that what it is a divine sharing of the highest order. And we are so fortunate to be in that sharing. And we are doubly fortunate to have lives that we know what we are participating in. There's a lot of people out there that don't have any purpose at all in life. Not at all. That's kind of sad. And here we know we can do something about it, and we can participate in it in such a way that we are actually in the pulse of the creation itself. Now, to accomplish the beings, or the potential beings, that potential had to be plunged into deep unconsciousness. And this was done so that we could start from scratch. We do that even in our life. When we start a new project, we try to forget everything we knew before and look at things anew. Max Heindel asked us to do that with reading the Rosicrucian CosmoConception. He says, just set aside all of your beliefs and such like that and read this and judge it for itself, and then you can throw it away or modify it or do whatever you like about it. This is actually done in business as much as it is done in spiritual growth. I have friends that have worked for IBM. And when IBM starts a new product line or a new activity, they don't use the old guys who are savvy. They don't use the guys who know, what works and doesn't work. They want people that have new, fresh ideas. And so they bring in all new people when they start something in that way. And so it's a principle that works even on a business level. So in effect, in being plunged into dark ignorance, we had to give up bliss. And I assume that this was voluntary, a volitional thing, but how you can be voluntary without even having a concept of a self, that's something way hard for me to understand. That's so deep that I don't know if I'll get to that in several lives. In fact, the Rosicrucian teaching teaches that very thing happened. That some didn't want to leave bliss, and they were not completely cooperative even at the very earliest stages of the creation, and they became stragglers. Again, I don't know how that was done, but it happened. In this state of unconsciousness and ignorance of the bliss, we were fundamental. It's sort of like when you first program a computer. The computer is completely dumb, and you're in control of everything. And you can't make, if you leave a statement out, nothing will happen. You have to be completely in control of everything. But that was our condition. We were completely ignorant, and we were worked on. We experienced form in those globes that were in space, which was a much different kind of space than we realize here. And we experienced spiritual life in the different attitudes of time that we went through. And we did this repeatedly in revolutions. We cycled through things again and again, through forms and life. We did this with what are called revolutions of consciousness. And revolution is a really good word because it has all kinds of different connotations. Now, these very simple principles were played off against each other, and they're phased off from each other, and this produces spirals and spirals within spirals and spirals within spirals within spirals. It goes on like that. The whole of it became enormously complex, as we mentioned early. Now, from simple astrology, we learn that elementary education is ruled by Gemini, and the abstract house from Gemini, the third house. And one of the basic keywords for Gemini is repetition. Repetition is the beginning of all education. Through repeated experience, even the dark ignorance that we were in, we were brought to an awareness of something. We are waked up by repeated things, even if it means banging on banging with a hammer. You can have an inch-thick steel boilerplate, and you can bang on with a ball-peen hammer, and it doesn't seem like you're going to do anything, but if you do it long enough, you're going to have a breakthrough. And if you're dealing with an evolution that takes millions and billions of years, it makes even hammering on boilerplate to seem like an easy thing. Now, it seems very paradoxical, but objective self-consciousness of an eternal thing begins with repetition of the experience of that eternal thing under various circumstances. A rhythmic repetition. And it can start out very similar. Very simple, I should say. The way, like, for example, in Waldorf education, which is a really advanced kind of education, they start out with something like these pieces of chalk. And in the very early grades, they weave them as if they were weaving, as if they were running strings together. And they do that at the very beginning. And as the kids grow up in the grades, the patterns that they weave become more and more complex, and they're really something to wonder at. By the time that a kid gets into fifth or sixth grade, they have the recognition of a pattern like that you and I would have to think and stop and take a long time to produce that kind of pattern. And so this is an example of education using a spiral principle of evolution that is what we are going through. We remember in this that evolutionary creation is an actualization of something that is potential. And an actualization means putting into action. And that means that the principle of action is intrinsic to creation. It's not free form, it's just not a line that goes off on a tangent. There is, for every action, there is that reaction. This means that everything in the creation is causal. And there is an action-reaction relationship. Now, it's not as simple as the creation goes on as something like the action-reaction of stepping on the head of a rake and bopping yourself in the head. And I still do that. Less than 2 weeks ago, I was going into the tool shed to get something that I needed for something that I was doing in the garden, and I stepped on the head of the rake and what's really humiliating about it is that the inner voice inside taunts you and says, you would do and understand great cosmic things and you don't have the sense to slow down and not step on the head of a rake. No pains and no pride is left. No pains are spared, and all of our pride gets challenged. Now, because objective, self-conscious state of a creative state of the spirit within the universal spirit, it sacrifices itself by initiating causal action. If you don't do anything, there's no growth. And when you initiate an action, especially a vertical action, you sacrifice yourself. At the same time, there is a counter-reaction that even the spirit transcends its own self. God becomes God to itself by sacrificing itself within itself to the creation. That is a beautiful, beautiful principle. If you think about it, all of the things that we are learning and experiencing, all the joys that we have, even in the sorrows that we go through, all of those things are going back to divinity, and its consciousness is expanded because it has sacrificed itself in what we are doing. So we can see that horizontally, we're doing things, and vertically there is this sacrifice that has a updraft behind it. They're there from the beginning, even in the immersion into ignorance. So that to be or not to be moment is eternal. It's something that's going on all of the time. And it is, from one point of view, it is almost like a suicide of the spirit to throw part of itself into dark ignorance. It's a big thing. Now, the actualization of potential in time is what we call progress. In this, we see forward-looking revolutions of consciousness in spirals, and within them there is another immersion into another state, so there are spirals within spirals. Now, this is a very, very sketchy and incomplete presentation because we're not trying to talk about the cosmography. We're just trying to get to one or two principles of looking back, so that these are principles that we can use in our lives as we try to unfold spiritually. So far we have established that there are basic principles in creation and evolution. We have also noted that repetitive spiral application of these principles is in a rhythmic harmony. It is a cosmos. It's organized. The universal spirit, as universal spirit, is chaotic. Everything is in it in potential and some of it in actual, and that's pure chaos. Now all we have to do is see how looking back fits into this. And before we can do that, we have to look at another thing. We can't eat all of our food for all of our life in one meal. We can't even eat all the food of our day in one sitting. If we're building muscle, like can Jesus bench press? How much can Jesus bench press? We can't get all of the exercise done in one time. We can't do it continually, or we would break down more than we would build. We have to rest. And when we rest, we give something within us to do what is necessary. Rest is not an inactivity, it's activity at a higher level. Everything gets processed so that we can go forward. So when we step back, there is that updraft into the Spirit, and the Spirit processes. So rest is an extremely important thing. And it's a principle that takes place on every level of the creation and every level of our lives. If we're building muscle, we rest. And we rest every day because our bodies become non-functional. I'm told that if you keep a cat awake for 3 days, the cat will die. And it may even be less than that. So it can't be any other way. And we're learning to create. But at the same time, the universal spirit, God, if you will, is also learning to create. It can't be any other way. If each of us is learning to create and doing creative experiments, it can't be that everything within the universal spirit is learning to create and the universal spirit isn't learning to create. And in that creative process, there is that incubation. There is that mulling over of it. It is the absorbing it into the consciousness so that things can go forward. If we keep doing something all the time and we don't rest from it, we don't leave any room for anything new. And if there isn't anything new, it would be a very dull and dreary creation. So the novelty or the newness of creation is important in the ultimate macrocosm and in the human microcosm. Robert Frost says it the best, and I repeat it again and again. He says, if there are no surprises for the poet, there will be no surprises for the reader. If there are no surprises for us, in such that something is new, there won't be any for the universal spirit. It isn't cut and dried. We're not in some kind of a sham activity. We're in something that's real. And in that real, things fight back. And in the real, everything is new. And doing something that has never been done before, even if it requires stepping back and resting and doing a creative pondering, that's what we have to do. Now, obviously, in a spiral creation, with all the spirals within spirals, there are many rests. So what happens after the rest? Everything starts all over again. It's somewhat analogous to the way we start afresh after a night of rest. We restart. We don't go all the way back to childhood or infancy. We restart not exactly where we left off. We all know that we've done something at night because in the morning we wake up and we can solve problems that we couldn't get around the day before. Moreover, when we come out of rest, the conditions are not the same. because the change in consciousness has caused a change in the nature of the substance in which you are working. And it's not the same because experience is irreversible. If we know something through experience, we can't unknow that. We can't unexperience it. So experience is also deepening. In all of this we can see, because there are always new conditions and we're always capable of going more deeply into them, that in repetition there are two things. There are variety, and there is depth. Now, there are excellent examples of this in our own human creative work, in our art. Every time we place a color among all the myriad of colors that can be, we place one hue next to another, it brings a new quality out. It brings a new quality out of each of the two other colors. The same thing is true of notes. If we take two tones and put them next to each other, and we do that in different harmonic settings, we understand a thought-feeling process that is completely new. So in evolutionary creation, every new experience brings out a new facet in the universal spirit. Sometimes it's big and sometimes it's small, but there is a infinite potential in the spirit, and by doing what we do, even the little things that we do in our lives, we are fulfilling something in the spirit. So all these people that want to drop out of evolution and not participate in it and pull away from it all are making an enormous mistake, because they are not feeding the universal spirit, and in a way they become spiritually malnutrient. They are starved from what the spirit can become by unfolding the different things through different experiences. So there is a service, a very great service in variety. Now, if variety was all that came out of the play between colors or of one principle in relation to another, there would be service, but that would be a little shallow. So we needed another dimension. When we learn a new piece of music, we first learn the notes. And then through repetition, if we're with an instrument, we learn the fingerings or the breathing, and we learn how to play it by heart. But that's not the end. Every rendition after that, we interpret. And we interpret in a better way than we had ever before, because we've grown in the process of doing that. I had a friend who taught himself to be a musician. He was a dropout in school, and he picked up a guitar and he played that guitar. Sometimes when he first got it, he just strummed it and would listen to the sound, and he couldn't even tune it. And he taught himself music, and he got further and further into music, and he was very original, and he got to a place where he hit a wall. And he couldn't go any further. He knew there was more music and greater music than what he was doing, but he couldn't get at it. So he threw the guitar down and he picked up a book. And he started reading. And when he started reading and he came back to the guitar, because he had new information, new variety in his consciousness, he could play things that he couldn't before. And he found out that the deeper the things that he read, and the more variety in the things he read, the more he could do in his music. And so, with each interpretation of a piece of music, we go deeper. So we have, again, that function of variety and of depth. Now it's the same way in the evolutionary creation, except in the evolutionary creation it's manifested in so many facets of our character at the same time. And in this, we get to a special kind of looking back. Finally, we're near the end of the talk, we finally get to looking back. It is a special looking back because it is a looking back while simultaneously looking forward. It's not quite like looking back when you're climbing a mountain, because if you do that, you're likely to fall off a cliff or something like that. We can look back and we can see where we are, but it's more like a discovery. It's sort of like rediscovering a love for somebody that we already love. If it's somebody that we're close to and someone that we cherish, if we are alive in what we're doing, we rediscover that love all over again. We may not even remember all of the earlier discoveries and rediscoveries. And we find ourselves alive in the new discovery. We may follow the same line in an emotional sequence, just like we follow the same line in a piece of music, but it is richer and it's deeper. Looking backward while moving forward is an evolutionary principle that is called recapitulation. Recapitulation has all of the qualities of the analogies that we just mentioned, plus one more that is very important. And the extra quality of recapitulation is that it enables us and it facilitates us for taking the next step forward. When I lived with that man who was a musical composer, it was, you understood the way the creative genius goes. He was writing a piece for orchestra, guitar, and voice. And he would play the piece of music as far as he had gotten, and then he wouldn't know what the next step was. And he would go over it again and again, like he was running in order to make the next step, and eventually he would make the next step. He would recapitulate and he would realize that in that sequence of notes relative to the theme that he was trying to produce in the music, that eventually by recapitulating it again and again, he understood the logic of it. And when you understand the logic of it, then you can take the next step. But it wasn't that simple with him. This was a man who had 4 planets in Taurus. And when he had the next step, the next note, or the next chord, he would try all kinds of other things that weren't it, just to make sure. And it was tedious. And sometimes this would go on for days and days in order to get maybe just a few bars of music. And it was just, I got the music in the basement, and it is very, very, it's 5-tone polyphony with no time signature. It's anything 8. It's like a question mark over 8. And it's all 12-tone music. You know, you can do whatever you want in it. But it was a real experience with him. And I didn't know it then, but I was learning the principle of recapitulation. And it's something I now understand. If evolution were that straight line activity, we wouldn't have anything to build on. That's the way society is now. Society is tangential. It doesn't have a direction that it's going. They talk about growth. You know, how many percent is the economy growing? Well, we live in a limited sphere. You can only grow so much, and everybody in the planet has to be in on it. And where are we going? And we get these terrible attitudes because we think in a straight line way. We have disposable stuff. Rather than recycling stuff, we throw everything away like we're never coming back again. And if we understand the principle of reality that what goes around comes around, that we're going to have to some way recycle all that trash. And I don't mean by trash just physical stuff. I mean our attitudes. I have a very excitable personality, which is pretty obvious. And that's both good and bad. The good part of it is that I have enthusiasm. The bad part is that the excitement disrupts continuity. It's sort of, if you're looking at a pond and you see a wonderful reflection, and then a wind comes by and excites the surface of the pond, and then that lovely reflection is broken apart into little pieces. That happens. Especially when I was younger on the path, I would follow a line of reason or a line of consciousness, and I would come to a discovery. And when that discovery came, I would get excited because, it's a wonderful thing. You make a discovery and it's like you're suspended in air. But when I'd get excited, I'd lose it all. And then a few months later, I'd follow that same line of reasoning, and I could take the next step further, and there's sort of a double whammy. You make a new discovery, and at the same time you realize if you hadn't gotten excited, that if you had more spiritual equipoise, you could have gotten this step and the next one beyond it. And that's something like that is what the principle of recapitulation is in our spiritual evolution. We have to relive things and then move forward. It's a tremendously slow process, even for us when we have tools like concentration and retrospection. In order to make spiritual growth, it's tremendously slow. But we have to keep with it. We have to, we have to keep going forward. So in these talks, we're examining looking back. And in this aspect, we can see many recapitulations in our own life, especially if we have a routine every day. We brush our teeth. Some of them are quite personal recapitulations, and some of them are very good habits. And some of them are idiosyncratic. Some of them are analogous recapitulations of cosmic activities, those big principles. So we see, even in our little life, if we can be aware of it, there's a logic to life. It is a psychologic, and it is a cosmologic. Our days and our lives are microcosms of the greater evolutionary creation. And the more we can realize that, and the sooner we can realize that, the more fruitful our recapitulations will be, and the more harmonious they will be to the grand process. We will be part of things. The sooner that we discover and look back at the things that we love and love them again in our daily lives, the more our lives are going to be a joy. We should be like Suzanne's talk, siempre feliz, all the time happy. So these moments of discovery in the little things of our life that we cherish are déjà vus. And sometimes they are cosmic déjà vus. And it's not just some little psychic phenomenon that we find to be pleasant and to be stunned by. It is seeing reality as it is. This is what it's all about. We study Rosicrucian philosophy not for the sake of Rosicrucian philosophy. We study Rosicrucian philosophy because it helps us to see reality. And when we see reality, it's easier to live reality. And that is our goal, is to live reality. And after that, we can throw all the philosophy away because it'll be found in ourselves and in the universe, and we will be in harmony, and we can make the progress without having to depend on reading books or anything like that. In this, if we are aware, we can follow by the principle of analogy, and we can see that things in our little lives are miniatures of things in the greater cosmic cycles. And when that happens, we're living a universal life. And we're that much closer to having a universal kind of consciousness, like a baptism of the Holy Spirit. Now, this topic of recapitulation is a very big topic. And it's too big for one talk. So we're going to continue talking about recapitulation and other forms of looking back tomorrow night. And this is as far as we're going to go for now. So we'll close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. I'm getting used to the new hours, and it's more fun. When you're not always tired, it's more fun. Yeah. Any questions? Comments?
I'll be right back. I meant to bring a fan in here.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna get more.
I got the ears out in front there. I got them